Hello and welcome to Terrain Oddity. My name is Jay and today I'm going to be showing you how to make this. And you might be thinking, what is that, Jay? It just looks like some ruins on a board. Well, yes, except you can now magnetize it and it becomes a chaos portal or a summoning portal or a wizard's portal, whatever you want to call it. It's a summoning portal for like your games of D&D or I was originally planning on having this in maybe like a Warcry, something like that, but we'll have to wait and see if it becomes semi-useful. And I've had a bit of a journey making this and we'll talk about it. I'll run you through how to make it. We're really just going to use foam board and like, well, you don't even need hot glue, PVA and some filler / spackle is all you really need for this. Obviously your basic materials, but we'll run through all of that. But before we go on to that, if you like this video, do press like and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more terrain content from me. And yeah, so we'll go into it. The one thing I want to say is you're going to hear an old narration and then I'm going to come back and talk about this specifically because when I made this originally, I made a portal and I did not like the way that it looked. I tried to do one out of hot glue and I didn't like it. So we're going to talk about how I salvaged it and the magnetizing idea I think is really cool because you could imagine for a D&D game you could have this as sort of like a puzzle. Maybe you press the runes and as soon as you get the right number of runes the portal summons. I really like that as an idea. Hopefully you do too. Let's crack on. Let's show you how I made it. First things first, I get 2 squares of foam board, probably about 20 centimeters length. It's completely up to you to decide how big you want the stone parts. I've just gone with that because I don't know, it felt right. I had a mini that I had near me and that's the one that felt right. And then I take the card off these 2 pieces of foam board. Now I use a hairdryer here, but I do have a video of how to do this, so do feel free to check that. I'll put that in the card in the top left, I think it is, top right maybe. And yeah, so I take the card off 2 pieces of foam board, and then on each piece of foam board, I'm essentially going to draw 3 circles. A small one, which is the bit that's going to have the portal on it, and then the one outside of that is going to be the like highest level of stone steps, and then the outer one is going to be like the lowest level of stone steps. So it's 3 concentric circles. I tried to do I got like a circle first, which was actually the lens cap to my camera. I drew a circle around that, and then I got the lid to my army painter knife and just marked out every so often the width of that because I was like, well, that's the width I'm going to have my steps. So I did that in like 4 places, and then I just freehandly, that's not even a phrase, but by freehand I just did a curve around it, so it made it all in. It was essentially dot to dot but with a curve, trying to keep it in like the same arc as my initial circle. And I did that twice. So I did the original circle, a middle circle, and then an outer circle. And then all we're going to do is we're going to cut that out. Now try and use a sharp knife because you want it to slice rather than like scrape it or like scratch it. You want a nice clean cut. And what we're going to do, we're going to cut out first the outer circle, so the full piece. And then for the inner one, we're not going to do the very, very inner circle. What we're going to do is the middle circle, essentially. Now, technically, you didn't need to have drawn the outer circle on that one. I just did so that I could pick the one that, you know, blended together the best. While we're cutting foam board, I'm going to make a base out of foam board. Now, I just got my initial circles, put this on a bit of foam board, got a pen, and just drew like a haphazard kind of circle. Not a perfect circle because we're making it look like natural, and you want it to be like a circular shape because that's going to help prevent warping, as it's long and narrow pieces that warp, whereas generally circle pieces won't do, and I've had no warping issues with this. So once you've cut out your shape, you're going to bevel the edges, and you want to bevel them like as much as you can, essentially maybe like 45 degrees. Again, a sharp blade here will help get a smooth cut. Now I actually do bevel the edges on the stone, but that's completely optional. I just made like different cuts so it wasn't all neat and tidy, but you don't necessarily have to do that. So now we're going to make the texture on the stone parts. What I'm going to do is I'm going to get a ball of tin foil or aluminium foil or aluminum foil for you Americans, scrunch it up, and we're just going to like press that over the exposed foam part of the circles. This is going to give it a nice texture. Try not to create a repeating pattern, so use different parts of the circle. Don't necessarily press it too hard because you don't want to squidge all that foam so that it becomes sort of non-existent. But you'll see it gives a nice texture. Once I've done that, and then I'm just going to carve in with a pen my stones. Now I do this just with a normal ballpoint pen. Initially I went over it very gently to get the size of the stones that I wanted. I completely eyeballed this and it worked out perfectly, but if you really wanted to, you could take a ruler and do one line on each side, then do a line on the other side, and then just sort of move it and move it and move it. Try and maybe do it like a clock, that would work. And for the outer circle, I just sort of do in between the stones. So I didn't want the lines to be exactly in line with the other line of the stone, so I off-centered it, if that makes sense. You'll hopefully see that in the video because I didn't explain that very well. Once I'd got the stones, I'm onto carving the runes. The runes, I just googled runes and drew a couple on a piece of paper and just sort of went from there. Again, I'm just using a pen to put them into the foam. You might want to go over with a knife a couple of times so you can get the depth and the indentation. I also do some stones so they look like they've maybe cracked or what have you, so it's not completely perfect, but you don't really have to do that. It's completely up to you. So yeah, I made all the fake runes up. Some of them are better than others. One of them's like a hashtag, which I sort of deeply regret. Once you've done that, you're pretty much ready to glue that onto your main bit of foam board as the base, and then we're going to base it in sand. So we're going to cover it in PVA, at least the bits where that we want the ground. We're going to cover that in PVA, and not watered down. We want to try and keep it less moisture as possible, so you just want a nice thin-ish cover of PVA. And then I'm covering it. I'm using bird sand and modelling sand, so whatever you want. Stones if you want, I've just gone with sand. Cover all the exposed areas, including the bit in the middle. That's what I'm using. At this point, I've also poked a hole in the middle of the top bit just so that when I do the portal in a moment, I'll be able to put like a toothpick in it, and I'll be able to sort of pin it. So you cover it all in sand, let that dry, and then we're going to cover the whole thing in black paint and PVA. Just about, I don't know, 50-50 mix. You don't have to worry about it too much. I actually painted the stairs before I did the sand. I should have just done it all in one. That was a bit wasteful of me. Once the black paint is dried, we're going to paint the dirt with brown. We're going to let that dry. We're going to dry brush it with a lighter brown. And the rocks we're going to paint grey. I have a warm grey. I wish I had like a more dark grey, but I only had this sort of very pale grey, but that's not a problem because I'm going to put a whitewash on it anyway, so it doesn't really matter too much. So I painted that grey. Then I went back in with the knife because I realised some of the detail was missing, so I just went back in the knife and cut my runes again just to, you know, emphasise some of the detail on the runes. I dry brushed the ground brown, but for the rocks, the stony part, I just used Nuln Oil, the GW wash. Feel free to make your own with black paint and water, but there wasn't a very big area here to do so. And once that had dried, I just dry brushed it again with a lighter grey. Well, I actually just used the initial grey because that was so light, and then added a little bit of white for a little bit of extra crispness. So once everything's dried on that, before we do the portal, I'm going to just cover it all in another layer of PVA. Well, not all of it, most of it in PVA. And I'm going to use Woodland Scenics Blended Turf and just cover the whole thing where I've put glue just as a basing kind of grassy look. You could do any kind of look you wanted. You can have it more barren, desert, whatever you want. And I'm also going to do finishing touches with some lichen or lichen and some bushes and grass tufts and that kind of stuff. When it came to making the portal, the old style of portal is basically a classic style. It's a round cut of foam board with hot glue on it in a spiral, but it didn't really work well for me because my hot glue was melting the card off the foam board and it was looking a little bit weird. So what I actually then decided to do was, and I'd seen it on another video, which was to get like this non-stick baking paper and to do the spiral on that and then glue that to the foam board. And that sort of worked. The problem with that is it's non-stick paper and the hot glue itself is very hard to get paint to stick to. And I didn't prime it, which I probably should have done, so I was having difficulty getting the paint to adhere to my portal. I tried to paint it like blue and lighter blue, and that looked fine, but I just wasn't really satisfied with it. I put a little cocktail stick in it and stuck it to the terrain piece, and it looked fine, but I just wasn't happy with it, so I decided not to release the video. And then the other day, I broke the piece of terrain because I knocked it over because I wasn't really caring about it. And the portal came off, and I had a bit of a eureka moment. Then I was like, number one, I can just make this another portal and still salvage this video. And number two, if I put a magnet in it, it's actually then going to allow me to make it, obviously magnetizable, you know what I mean? I can put it on and put it off so that we can have it as like a summoning portal. And I think for like usability for D&D, that's quite cool because you could have it like a rune, you know, maybe like a puzzle. So for the new portal, I obviously decided, oh, I'm going to put a magnet in it. So I cut a circle of foam board. We're going to do it in a very similar way. In that foam board, I didn't drill a hole. I just sort of pushed a magnet into it with a bit of super glue. Super glue can melt foam, so just be careful there. Obviously, on my original terrain piece, I already had a hole. Make sure you make a hole like later on. If you could just drill a hole. It's not really the end of the world, but you need a hole for the magnet if you are going to magnetize it, obviously. In this case, I had a hole, so I put the magnet in, covered it in filler, painted it brown, and then just put some flock over it, and that got my base, the main piece of the terrain, fine. So once they're both magnetized, you can check that that's all working fine. Make sure it's all going straight, because you know, if you've got a bit of a slant in your magnet, you can end up with a slanted portal. And as I said, we've got this round bit of foam board. We're going to cover one side in filler, well, and maybe the edges, because we don't want the edges showing as well. Cover the one side in filler. And then you get your finger, wet it, and basically you want to just smooth it out so it's all smooth, and a nice clean layer. And then I took an end of a brush, dipped that in water, started in the middle, and just created a spiral going all the way outside. Now I didn't do it too perfectly. I did, in fact, if anything, I sort of did it like you were sketching. You were using a pencil to sketch the circles, because I wanted multiple like rifts and lines and stuff like that. I didn't want it to be too fake looking. So do your spiral, let that dry. Once you're happy with it, use water. Water is your friend. And once you've done one side, you've got to let that dry, flip it over to the other, do the other side, and you know, we're pretty much good there. So I sprayed it black. You could probably just paint it by hand if you wanted, but I sprayed it black. And for painting, I did a coat of red, just to make a nice even coat of red on both sides. Again, you might have to, unless you want to stick it on a magnetized stick or something, you're going to have to do one side and then the other. Painted it all red, and then for blending, I just put a bit more red in the middle, then got my yellow, you know, wet blended it so it was lighter in the middle. Not a fancy technique. I'm not trying to make it look exceptional. I did sort of dry brush towards the edges, just to try and make it a little bit visually interesting, so the raised bit were a bit highlighted and the darker bits were a bit recessed, but you don't necessarily have to do that. Anyway, once you've done both sides, you're going to let that dry, and you're pretty much done. I think a reasonably salvaged piece. So I think I'm just really happy with the idea. Like, I'm not particularly myself a D&D player, and I hadn't really thought about how you might use that in a D&D game. But when I came up with this idea of magnetizing the portal, I was like, damn, that's good, because it means you could create some sort of like puzzle. Maybe you've got to stand on certain steps or what have you, that then summons the portal, or maybe it's an evil portal and bad guys are coming out of it and you have to turn it off, and maybe you've got to turn it off in a specific way. I would say I'm not. The size, it looks small, but when I actually put like a 28mm figure near it, it looks perfectly fine. Yeah, I'm actually now really happy with it. Initially, I thought it was okay, but I wasn't thrilled. But now I'm over the moon with it. I actually think it's fantastic. I might even give this to a friend who actually does play D&D instead of trying to use it as terrain. Also, storage-wise, well, you know, instead of maybe it breaking, I can just store it flat like that. Perfect. You know what I mean? So I just think it's improved a lot. You could change the style of portal, etc. I just really like it as an idea. Yeah, it's not like if I shake it. No, it's not actually doing anything if I shake it. Obviously, if you were too aggressive, it probably would fly off, but that's just magnets for you. I'm happy with the salvage product, basically. I was going to ditch it, but I think we've saved it by changing the portal. I'm happy with the design. I think the filler perhaps looks a little bit better. You can do a bit more carving into it. You can sort of design it a little bit better than hot glue. Unless you're gonna, I'm just not very good at using hot glue, I think. Unless you're gonna completely fill the whole thing with hot glue and make spirals with the hot glue that's already there, I think it's quite difficult. Whereas filler, I found, was quite easy. So all in all, this is really cheap. This is literally foam board filler, and you could get away with PVA. You don't need hot glue, and then your basic materials. And I think that's, as a terrain piece goes, I think that's fine. My painting of the portal, perhaps not the greatest, but I make terrain, not paint jobs. So yeah, I'm happy with that. Hopefully you are happy. You know, you think that's quite cool. I think that's quite a cool idea. Either way, if you're interested in terrain as a whole, you just want to see interesting stuff, press like, subscribe, have a beautiful day, You can always support me on Patreon. I really do appreciate anybody who supports me on Patreon there. There's links in the description, all that kind of jazz. Have a beautiful day, and goodbye.